surface if you just leave it to its own devices. Stamping is one way to bring a little more depth and character to concrete. Now when we do stamped concrete, we typically add one color to the concrete that we're mixing and placing, and then a second color is broadcast along the top and then stamped down. It's a color and it's also a release agent which allows us to pull our stamps back off of the concrete without pulling the concrete away from the slab surface. So you can see you get a deep mottled color, and this one, for example, is designed to look like a slate or some type of stone. And you can really play with the colors and textures with different stamp patterns to get different designs. It adds something of character to a house rather than just having a finished troweled surface. It's one way to put a little more character into your floor. And these are rubber stamps that we're going to use for the actual stamping process of the concrete. Now they've got different sizes and different textures on each one, as you can see. There's a small one here and then a larger one underneath it. And they have different patterns on each, so that when you're using one against the other, you don't have a continuing pattern that's obvious in the finished work. So here you can see we're broadcasting the color on top of the concrete. Now this is the second color we're using. As I said earlier, we have one color already in the concrete mix. So you see you just kind of toss it out. We're using a heavy brush and just slide it out across the surface. Now the areas that you're not stamping and that don't have the secondary color on it, you want to continually work with a trowel. You recall earlier we talked about putting down con film to slow down the curing process. We've got one guy working the trowel continually to keep that surface malleable so that the stamps will actually work. So when you go to lay your stamps down, it's important that you don't slide them into position because that will show up in the actual concrete surface. So here we'll lay one end down where we want it, roll it down into place, and once it's in place, then we can use a tamper to tamp that pattern that I showed you earlier on the stamps themselves. Use a concrete tamper to, or excuse me, just a regular tamper to imprint the surface of the concrete. One thing that's really important with the tamper is that you hit straight down. If you hit the stamp with the tamper at an angle, you'll rip right through the stamp and ruin the stamp. And these are not cheap. They're fairly expensive. So if you're going to be doing this work yourself, you want to be able to take good care of your stamps. So work your way all the way around. You can start on the outsides and work your way into the middle, however you want to do it, so that you remember that so you can be sure that you've hit every spot with the tamper. You don't want to miss a certain spot and then have that show up later once you come back to finish the floor. Now we'll come in and bring the second stamp. We're going to use two large stamps for the majority of this building to cover more ground quickly. You see we lay it down over the top so that the new sheet laps over the old sheet, and then we'll reverse that. We'll put the new sheet underneath and continue with the stamping. So what this does is it creates a seamless edge. So we're going for the look of a natural stone. We don't want to have one stamp end and the next one begin next to it. So this way you get a very seamless transition from one stamp pattern to the next. Again, working our way all the way around with firm and controlled tamping so that we don't blast through the actual stamp itself. Now you can see we only throw out as much of the secondary color release as we can do with the stamps. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. If we lay too much color down, it actually will slow down the process and it'll mess up the curing of the concrete. So we'll just lay it out as we go, enough to move one stamp to the next. And again, slowly peeling it back rather than trying to slide it out of position. You'll notice when we turn, it's going to be hard to tell here on this because we're turning directions, but when you add the next stamp pattern down, you always want to turn it 90 degrees from where it just was so that you don't pick it up and lay it down as in a line, because then that pattern will start to repeat itself and you'll start to recognize it in the finished product. So by taking your second stamp and actually rotating it 90 degrees, you'll get a much better, less predictable finish. And again, don't forget to have someone in the background working the concrete to keep that con film. You can see areas where it was drying right there where he just slid over. We're keeping that active and keeping the concrete pliable so we can do the stamping process. We've got a long way to go before we get around this whole building. So now we'll continue around the outside of the building first. It's important to have a game plan so you don't end up getting stuck somewhere and not being able to get off the building. So here, again, we'll work around the outside first and tamping as we go. Again, just laying enough of the color release ahead of us so that we have something to work on, but not so much that we're putting it out ahead of time where we can't get to it within a reasonable amount of time. And when you go over the grooves that we'd cut earlier, we want to make sure to use our wheel to clean those out so we don't have lots of color sitting in the. If we have too much color sitting down in those grooves, it shows up as a fairly obvious color change in the final product. And you can see here as he turns around, he's not only turning the stamp from one direction to the other, but he also rotated it 90 degrees. Again, laying it down and then going back and stamping over the top of it. Now we're moving back down along that same line, going in the opposite direction now. So the idea is to keep moving and to keep shifting the way that you lay the stamps down. Like I say, the turning it of 90 degrees, that basically gives you a random pattern out in the field. If you use it the same way, it's going to be very obvious in the finished product. So that's really important to remember, to keep rotating the stamps 90 degrees as you shift them from one position to the next. So I'm aware that this is repetitive, but I'm going to show you again to turn it 90 degrees as you change directions and add your next stamp. It's possibly the most important thing about creating a natural looking pattern. And then again to put the new stamp underneath the old stamp. And go back and clean out your lines so you don't end up with strong colors down in all the grooves. For areas where the large stamp won't fit, we have the smaller secondary stamp that I showed you earlier on. Now again, you don't have to use the tamper. We're just going with a magnesium trowel and hitting it hard enough to imprint that pattern onto the concrete. This is a great thing to have for areas like this where you just can't get that large one in.